Redistricting, gerrymandering, and the right to reform our government. And we're here celebrating 10 years of advocacy and preparing for the next 6 months. And for those who don't know, my name is Carol Cunningham. I'm the chair of Fair Districts PA, one of the co-founders of the organization. And when we started in 2016, I was the vice president for government and social policy for the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, which was one of the founding organizations. The other organizations included Committee of 70, Common Cause PA, Council of Churches Advocacy was the host for our very first meeting. And there are some other organizations that no longer exist that were around at the time and were with us for a couple of years and are no longer with us. What I want to talk about tonight, I'm going to give you some vocabulary. Anybody who comes to our Fair Districts meetings, we always start with vocabulary, and some of these words you'll know, and there might be a new one. There might be one that you don't know yet. Really fast history. Tell a little bit about what's happened here in Pennsylvania. And connect the dots. I'm always looking for ways to, why does this matter? I had never heard of redistricting until 11 years ago. And then once I heard about it, I thought, oh, this is the key to a whole lot of stuff that I was not aware of. And so I'm always trying to say, why do we care about these maps? Why do we care about the way that they're drawn? Why does this matter? So I want to spend quite a bit of time talking about that. I want to talk about where we are right now in the state, but kind of where we fit in the national landscape and what we need to do. And then I want to talk about how you can help. And really, my purpose this evening is to give you the tools you need to be active. That's my purpose. This is not just to kind of inform us, although information is incredibly important. But information without action is not going to help us get where we need to go. And I'm hoping that you're here because you want to help us accomplish the change that we need to see here in Pennsylvania. So that's my goal. And I'm going to do my best to give you the tools that you need, or to point you towards the tools you need, and to answer some questions that you might have. I would encourage you to put questions in the chat. We have many folks who can answer the easy questions. The questions that will take longer, we might hold and answer some at the end, although you might find some of them getting answered along the way. So as you listen, you might say, oh, there's the answer to that question I had. And if there are questions that we don't have time for tonight, which is totally possible, then we will schedule some future meetings. There are experts who we can invite to participate. We have contacts around the country who have been involved in this in different states in different ways. So tonight is kind of, here's where we are, here's what we're doing, here's what we need. And if we find that there's other topics that we want to explore, other experts we want to bring in, then we will certainly do that as we go forward. So quick vocabulary. And for some of you, I said this is very familiar. Some of this is review. Some of you not familiar. Some of our legislators actually don't know the difference between some of these words that we're going to talk about. But the first word is reapportionment. And reapportionment is, I just realized something's in the way of my screen. Reapportionment or apportionment is the other word that's used. It's the redistribution of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives. And normally that happens after the national census, which is every year that ends in 0. That's the norm. We're obviously in a year that is not the norm, but reapportionment is the redistribution of those seats. If a state grows in population, it'll get more seats. Even if a state doesn't lose population, if it doesn't keep up with the growth in other states, it might lose a seat. So Pennsylvania has been losing a seat every decade for quite a while. Even though we're not necessarily losing population, there are some states that are growing much faster. And right now we have 17 seats. We lost one from the last decade. And a thing that I didn't realize for a while in this was that we are the 5th most populous state in the country. We are the most populous swing state. And that puts us kind of in a frame where we become of interest in a number of different ways. And that's something just to kind of keep in mind. But take a quick look. The states that have more population than ours are California, Texas, New York, Florida, And Indiana rivals us in number of districts, but we actually have a larger population. So the second word, redistricting, that's the redrawing of voting district lines. And in 1964, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case that determined that the Constitution requires one person, one vote, and that means districts need to be redrawn. Before that, some states would redraw their districts pretty often. Some states would just never do it, which would mean you'd have one district with a lot of people, some districts with not so many. So ever since 1964, states have been required to review and redraw district lines following the national census in years ending in one. The next one will be by law 2031, but we're seeing lots of states just kind of, there's nothing in federal law that prohibits redistricting between the census years. Some states actually have prohibitions in their state constitutions. Pennsylvania doesn't have that in our constitution, but it's not in federal law that you can't redistrict in between. So states determine congressional and state House and Senate district boundaries. And in Pennsylvania, the congressional map is enacted as a bill. It must be passed in both chambers and be signed by the governor. And that's the case in many states. In many states, it's done as a bill, must be passed in both chambers, signed by the governor. I'm not going to go into detail on, there's lots of different ways this is done, but in many states, that's how it's done. In our state, the House and Senate maps are drawn by the Legislative Reapportionment Commission, which was established by a Pennsylvania constitutional amendment in 1968, following that Supreme Court case that said that redistricting has to take place. And for that commission, the majority and minority leaders from both House and Senate are on the commission, or they choose a delegate, which has never happened. They are the ones who do it. Now, that's been the case since this was begun in 1968. The fifth member is the chair, and the chair is supposed to be picked by the other members. That has also not happened since 1968. They have not agreed on a chair. If they can't agree, which has been the case every time, then the majority of the PA Supreme Court appoints the chair, who's then confirmed by a majority vote of the four initial commissioners. And this past time, this was the commission. The Senate Majority Leader Kim Ward, Minority Leader Jay Costa, House Majority Leader was Carrie Benninghoff, House Minority Leader was Joanna McClinton. The chair, Mark Nordenberg, was of interest. He had been recommended, nominated by Republican court members in previous decades, had not been the final selection. And this time he was recommended by Democrats, and he was passed unanimously by the PA Supreme Court, and turned out to be a very nonpartisan, very fair commissioner. But third word, gerrymandering, manipulation of electoral maps for political advantage. And the picture here is Elbridge Gerry, who was the first. He was not the first, but he was the one whose name was given to this in 1812 when he signed off on a map that looked like a salamander, which is where the name comes from. And people have corrected me. I'll just say I know. Elbridge Gerry was the way his name was pronounced. So some people call it gerrymandering, but most people say the word gerrymandering. And what it is the same people who draw the maps with a vested interest in creating districts that will help them or their party stay in office. And we've seen across the last several decades, new technologies allow far greater precision in manipulating maps and controlling outcomes. And one little interesting fact was Elbridge Gerry was a member of the Democratic Republican Party. So when people say, well, one party, the Democrats started this, the Republicans started it, Elbridge Gerry was a member of the Democratic Republican Party. So in a way, both parties have had a start in this, and both parties have certainly done it all across the country, across the last several centuries. A few more words, though. Cracking, splitting a population and spreading its members among several districts where they become an irrelevant minority. And we're seeing that happen in states across the country. You might remember this district that was nicknamed Goofy Kicking Donald. That was a really classic example of cracking. And if you look at what was going on there, you see that there was this kind of drawing through places like Westchester to crack out Democrats who might make a majority if the district was drawn compactly, but were then separated out into districts that reached that particular district reached through 5 counties and splintered quite a number of cities or smaller towns to create a very red group of districts in a very purple region. And so there's cracking that's been done in areas across the country. We had a lot of that in our last decade. And then another word is packing. And so this was another from the congressional map of the last decade, where you can see this district going along, through Philadelphia, but then running up into Delaware County to pack in blue regions to leave the rest of the county red for that other goofy kicking Donald district. So that was an example of packing. There's 2 new words, though, that I did not know until more recently. One is buddymander, and that's incumbent protection by both sides. We had Walter Olson from the Cato Institute join us at a conference a couple of years ago, and he introduced this word, buddymander, which is we'll protect our guys, you can protect your guys. And it's the leaders on both sides agreeing to a map that keeps them safe and keeps their buddies safe. It's also called a sweetheart deal. And this is another one that I've heard even more recently, the dummymander. And that's a gerrymander that backfires. Bernie Groffman, an expert in University of California, he says the carrying capacity of any lifeboat is limited. If you try to overload it, the boat may sink or tip over, washing people overboard. And in the same way, the carrying capacity of a party's voting strength is limited. If you try to make it carry too much weight, spread the party's voting strength too thin among too many districts, the lifeboat will probably go under in bad electoral weather. And that's something to remember as you're, kind of watching what's happening around the country. Dummymanders are totally possible, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it's a word to remember. You can't stretch too far without running into some serious risks. So just a little bit about Pennsylvania recent history, the 2011 congressional map. And this will be one that is studied, talked about. States around the country have looked at this carefully. If you get into looking at gerrymandering litigation, this is now a top story. And this was our map in 2011. You can see that goofy kicking Donald district down there in the right. You can't see that cracked the packing district #1 down along the Delaware River. It's kind of very narrow and hard to see, but that was our map. And if you look at that, you could kind of say, that doesn't look right. Our state constitution talks about districts being compact and not dividing counties or municipalities more than necessary, and this one certainly doesn't look compact. And so what happened was the League of Women Vote. Oh well, just in terms of numbers. If you look at the way that map played out, it didn't matter what voters did; the outcome was locked in. So whether voters voted a little bit more blue or a little bit more red, the outcome was 13-5. It just didn't matter. So in 2017, the League of Women Voters filed lawsuit with the Public Interest Law Center, and it was filed in Commonwealth Court. It was moved to the PA Supreme Court. And then in January 2018, the court found the map contrary to the Pennsylvania Constitution's promise of free and equal elections and invited the Pennsylvania General Assembly to provide a new plan. And there's a couple important things in here. #1 is most redistricting litigation about partisan gerrymandering before that had gone to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court had said, we have nothing to do with that. We have there's no standard. We're not getting involved. And the U.S. Supreme Court had said, there's nothing that we have to say about that. The Pennsylvania Constitution's promise of free and equal elections was of interest to see, is that a right that we can actually experience? Is that a right that we can call on? Is that a right that we can litigate? And so this was a new approach that the Public Interest Law Center and their partners tried, and the court said yes. Those rights promised in Article 1 of the Pennsylvania Constitution are important and are real and should be recognized. So that's number one, just to be aware of. The second piece that's important to remember is that the court didn't just say, okay, we're giving you a new map. They went back to the General Assembly and said, it's your job to draw a lawful map. And so you need to do it, but you have a deadline because there's primaries coming and we need a map for those primaries. The General Assembly, the leaders said no. They simply refused to do it. And at that point, then the court said, well, we need a map for the primaries. And so the court provided the new plan. How did that play out? Well, first of all, I just want to, say that was a huge historic win because it was appealed to the state constitution and the state court. And it was the first successful partisan gerrymandering case in the country. And it was based on the state constitution, resulting in a new congressional map. And what's interesting is that the Pennsylvania Constitution is the model and template for many other state constitutions. And in fact, our state constitution first drafted and passed in 1776, the first Pennsylvania state constitution, has been a model for other countries as well. It's something that we want to be celebrating this year. It's the 250th anniversary of that constitution. But other states that have the same free and equal election provision looked at the lawsuit and said, oh, this is really, really important. Whether their courts will recognize that is a different story, but that's certainly a thing that other states have looked at and have discussed, and is of great importance to this topic of partisan gerrymandering, especially as the Supreme Court continues to look like they are not going to weigh in and not going to engage. So the 2011 plan was found contrary to law, and the new court-ordered remedy plan was put in place for the 2018 election. And interestingly, 9-9, it came back much, much closer to the way the votes were cast. And the next election was also 9-9, again, reflective of the way the votes were cast. So that was an important remedy, but it was temporary. There's no guarantee for future maps. There's that court precedent, but how does that play out? What are the exact margins of that? I'm not totally clear. And it was partial because the PA House and Senate districts were still among the most gerrymandered in the country last decade. And by one measure, votes cast to seats won. In 2018, Pennsylvania's state house districts were 50% worse than the two next most badly gerrymandered states. So it's important to remember, Pennsylvania has suffered under gerrymandering for quite a long time, and extreme gerrymandering. It's not just partial; it's been pretty extreme gerrymandering, and so that has been an issue. We're not there now, but that has been the case in the past. Along the way of advocating for redistricting reform, we learned that we have an incredibly unresponsive legislature. I think some of us started this thinking, oh, we'll learn about this. We'll advocate for new maps. We'll advocate for a new process, and we'll be successful. I should have been warned. The first meeting I went to with legislators, Senator Lisa Boscola was the one who introduced the first bill that we supported. And at the first meeting with her, there were legislators from both parties and legislators from both chambers and a room full of policy staff. And at a certain point, she looked towards me and the league president at the time and said, unless the advocates are very loud, this will never happen. Which surprised me because it seemed to me if all those legislators from both parties, both chambers, thought this was a good idea, certainly this would happen. And what we learned was we could have a very large rally, which was the largest rally that's been in the Capitol Rotunda in a very long time. And they've since forbidden rallies of that size, which legislators like to point out to me. It's because of us that they made that rule. But the bill that we were working on at that time, one of them, House Bill 722, it had 110 co-sponsors, which is more than a majority. And yet it was gutted in committee with less than 24 hours notice and never voted out of committee. And then the Senate bill that we were working on had 21 co-sponsors. It was amended in committee then amended on the Senate floor to include a judicial district provision, a constitutional amendment to create judicial districts, which we couldn't support and neither could other organizations. And when it went to the House, it was buried under 600 plus amendments. So we learned a lot through that process. Sometimes people say, well, none of our bills ever came out of, never got a vote. Yes, they did get votes. One got a vote to gut the bill completely in committee. The other got a vote to be amended on the floor, amended in committee, amended on the floor, and then buried. So there have been votes, but not on the bill as we intended, and not in a way that brought it to a final vote. So we learned that we have a unresponsive legislature, and along the way, we've talked to lots of partners who have advocated for many things that have been stalled, that have been gutted, that have been mistreated along the way. And we've learned that our legislature has a very, very hard time accomplishing what the people of Pennsylvania would like it to accomplish. We also did a poll in 2019 and found that a majority of Pennsylvanians would like to see an independent commission. 67% said independent commission. And they said, the current system allows party leaders to put their own interests ahead of voters' interests. It creates polarization and gridlock, allows elected officials to choose their voters. Despite that, despite the many co-sponsors, despite the hard work, we learned that there's no final action and that it's really hard to get heard and to get something done in our state legislature. And there have been redistricting reform bills since the 1980s, and none have had final action, despite lots of work, despite lots of attention. So there was an interesting book that just came out called Aligning Election Law. And I want to highlight this because it really bears on what we're talking about. And the question is, do the things that does a legislature align with the electorate's wishes? And the person who wrote it, actually, Nicholas Stephanopoulos, he's been very active in the redistricting world, and has been part of litigation, has been part of a lot of research on this. And this book basically says there's a significant gap. There are many areas in which the electorate's wishes and the government's output are greatly misaligned. And what he finds is that this is the strong influence. There are two major reasons. One is the strong influence of donors, in other words, campaign money, and the other involves gerrymandering. And the headline, Money in Politics and Partisan Gerrymandering Matter More Than Any Other Electoral Rules Today. So he's done quite a bit of talking about that. And that's basically his sense is gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, and money in politics make it really, really difficult for the policies that the electorate wants to be put into place. And we have seen that. We have seen that, the voters can say we want an independent commission, but it doesn't happen. But it's not just redistricting. So in the time that we've been working on this, very early on, I began to realize there's a lot of things connected. I drew this rather rough graphic, which has been reused a long time, and we keep looking at it and saying, "Wow, these pieces that I put here, not really knowing what I was talking about when I drew this graphic, are the case." Partisan gerrymandering creates divided communities, uncompetitive districts, unaccountable government, unfair procedural rules. Makes it incredibly difficult for the essential functions of government to get done. No budget agreement. It's all connected. All of these things are connected, and we see them in states that have the worst gerrymandering. They're also likely to have the worst in terms of unaccountable government, unfair procedural rules. But in many ways, Pennsylvania is one of the worst in this area. And there's one other piece that so part of what we've done as we've been researching this is we realized we need to kind of create a space for researching this and to share what we've learned, because there's lots of organizations, and you might have been part of other organizations that have advocated for other things for decades. Minimum wage is one that's caught some public attention just recently. Every state around us has raised their minimum wage multiple times since 2009. Pennsylvania can't seem to do it, despite the fact that there's a huge public support for raising minimum wage and very little opposition to it, except from a handful of businesses and a handful of kind of partisan think tanks. Most Pennsylvanians think, why in the world have we not raised minimum wage? And yet it's misaligned. The voters have, what they want. It doesn't happen. And there's many other areas. So we started Fix Harrisburg. We have a Fix Harrisburg website. If you haven't taken a look at it, please do, because there's a lot of information there just about how our state legislature is dysfunctional and unaccountable. And one piece that I've added as I've looked at this is the incredible influence of money in all of this. There's a great deal of money that flows through think tanks, PACs, super PACs into our legislative leaders' coffers and then distributed from there to their colleagues. So this is all connected. So this is our Fix Harrisburg website. Take a look, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I just wanted to flag that in the last decade that became something that we were learning and paying more attention to. So where are we right now? In 2021, the public attention and input made a really big difference on our redistricting process. And I want to say thank you to every person who participated in that, because it was a huge public effort. Many people learned how to give testimony. Many people learned how to look at maps. Many people participated in hearings. Many participated in our own public, our mapping process. One of the things that we advocated for with the Supreme Court, when it became clear that the committee, the first four commissioners were not going to choose a chair, we petitioned the PA Supreme Court to choose somebody who wouldn't just be a rubber stamp for one party or the other. And they chose Mark Nordenberg, as who I mentioned had been recommended by Republicans and Democrats and was chosen unanimously. As soon as he was appointed, we petitioned him with we had a bill we called LACRA, which is the Legislative and Congressional Redistricting Act, which had some standards for public input, for a public website, for public meetings, and for a fair process, transparent process. He wasn't able to change the way the commission operates, and he couldn't put new rules in place for how the maps were drawn, but he did his very best to have a really public, transparent process, and he had far more meetings than even we asked for, and so that made a big difference. He held 7 public business meetings, 16 public hearings, invited 36 expert witnesses. I was an expert witness. It was kind of a daunting process, but I was happy to be included. Heard from 145 citizen witnesses. Received over 6,000 written testimony submissions. So thank you to all of you who submitted testimony, and considered over 100 district plans or parts of plans. And so the website is still there, Legislative Reapportionment Commission website. You can see the testimony that was offered. You can see the meetings. You can see the expert testimony. It's all still there, and it made a difference. So this is a kind of busy slide, but it's Plan Score is a website that offers a way to look at the partisan bias in maps, and they have 4 different metrics that they offer. Some metrics work better in purple states, some work better in very one-party states, and partisan bias is one that I find is effective in helping us understand how Pennsylvania's maps work. And they look at, if it's a 50-50 election, what's the outcome? Do they get the same number of seats or not? And then kind of what happens if it's a more blue or a more red, is that appropriate reflected in the way the outcomes show up? And what you see is for our state house, our 2012 map, as I said, was one of the most gerrymandered in the country. And our new one is one of the most balanced. Which is amazing, and that is in large part due to you folks and us working really hard to say this matters a lot, calling attention to it. It's also in large part, thank you to Mark Nordenberg, but also it's in part because uh, the two party leaders could not could not agree, and kind of got into some conflict, which meant that then Mark Nordenberg became a much stronger voice in advocating for how the map turned out, and we ended up with a very fair map. The Senate process was a bit different, and in his final report, Chair Nordenberg discusses this, that with the Senate map, the two Senate leaders talked together, came up with a map. He had very little to do with it. His mapper had very little to do with it. And it protected quite a few legislators and did not go quite as far in protecting communities as we would have liked to see, but still brought the map back from being a pretty strong gerrymander to a map that is slightly biased, but much more reflective of Pennsylvania voters. And right now, the Republicans have a 3-seat majority, but that's from the votes, and that could change if voters and candidates work hard to change it. In other words, it's a map that our voices actually could be heard, and it's much more reflective of the voters of Pennsylvania. So we have better maps for House and Senate. And then for the congressional map, there was an interesting process where people submitted maps. One of those maps was chosen without any explanation of why it was chosen. Then it was amended behind closed doors with no explanation of why that was done. And we petitioned the governor not to sign it when it came out of both chambers. And he did not sign it. That's the 2012 map, how gerrymandered that was. This is the map that came out of the House Bill 2146, the Republican map, which was then submitted to the Supreme Court. So when the governor didn't sign the map, the General Assembly could have. They had an opportunity then to produce a map that the governor would sign. That's the way the process is supposed to work. Produce something that the governor will sign. And they, again, said no. That wasn't of interest to create a map that the governor would sign. So then it had to go to the Supreme Court because the primary deadline was fast approaching. So the Supreme Court did something kind of interesting. They invited submissions of maps by citizens, and the Republican legislators submitted the map that had passed through the legislature, House Bill 2146. And then others submitted maps. And if you look at this, you can see House Democrats submitted a map, the governor submitted a map. I was part of the Al Lee interveners. That was the Common Cause League of Women Voters, Fair Districts PA group that drew a map that was submitted. Draw the Lines, the project that Committee of 70 had been running with citizen mappers, drew a map. So there were 13 maps that were submitted, and then testimony given from experts on those maps. And then the court chose this map, the Carter map, which was the least change from the 2018 map. We went from 18 districts to 17. That was the one that was the least change, but also one of the most balanced. If you look at it, it's actually slightly closer to dead center than the one that I was part of, the Ali interveners, and quite a fair map. The final map yielded a nine Democrat, 8 Republican seats in 2022, 10 Republicans, 7 Democrats in 2024, and analysts call it one of the 2 most responsive congressional maps in the country right now. So we have better maps than we did last decade. And that map, as I said, is currently balanced, responsive. It's called swingy. And the reason they call a map swingy is it actually swings. And as I said, there's the votes cast and the seats won in the last 2 elections. And as I said, it's one of the best in the country. And just for a little comparison, look at the difference between the map of 2011 and those weirdly shaped districts wandering all over the place. And this one, you can look at it and say, that makes sense. Of course, there are going to be districts with the lines a little different. County lines are unusual in Pennsylvania. City lines are unusual in Pennsylvania, but this is certainly much more compact and much more reflective of, communities and much more responsive to voters. So in a certain sense, we're in a really good place. We have good maps, and our votes matter, and it's important that we pay attention to that and participate and encourage people to run for office and make sure that we vote and encourage other people to vote. But despite those better maps, there's no guarantees for the future. There's nothing in law that will guarantee better maps. And what we learned in this last process is the personalities of those five commissioners make a big difference. So the fact that Mark Nordenberg, Chairman Nordenberg, was a man of great intelligence and integrity, I admire him a great deal. That made a big difference. It's very easy for commission chair to just say, sure, I'll just go along with the party that I support, or just, say, well, I don't know much about this. I'll let them kind of run the game. The personality of that person makes a huge difference. He was the first commission chair to hire a mapper and to hire a attorney beyond himself. He's an attorney himself, but he hired another attorney to really look into the law and to make sure they were following the law. And then the personalities of the majority and minority leaders make a big difference as well. So the way it worked in the Senate was very different from the way it worked in the House. And it's interesting to think that the entire state is dependent on the personalities of these particular people. So there are no guarantees for the future, and our process for redistricting the House and Senate maps gives party leaders more direct control over their own and their colleagues' districts than any other state in the country, and more than any other country in the world. So many states, this is done as a bill, and it's just voted on. Other states have commissions where there might be some legislators on the commission, but there are people that are not legislators on the commission as well. Washington State, the party leaders each can choose somebody to be on the commission, and then those people choose the chair, but that's not the party leaders themselves sitting on the commission and deciding those district lines. Pennsylvania is the only state that allows those majority leaders and minority leaders that level of complete control over their own districts and their colleagues. And we've had legislators, I've had legislators from both parties and both chambers say, if I don't do what the leader tells me, they say they're going to draw me off the map. And there are legislators who say, I didn't do what they wanted me to do, and they don't actually draw them off the map because they live in Pennsylvania, but they can draw a district that puts them almost completely into a different district. They can draw a district where they're a little sliver into a district where there's a well-liked incumbent, and makes it absolutely impossible for them to win. And we saw there was an independent senator up in Northeast PA who was politely drawn off the map in this last go round. And it's something that the leaders can do. And we are the only state that allows that level of control over the maps. And what happens from that, there's no final vote on the maps, and there's no required explanation for where the lines are drawn, although the legislators themselves can look and say, oh, this is what they did, and often understand what they did. When I first was getting involved in this, a legislator who had been in office and then chose not to run again invited me for lunch to talk about why gerrymandering was so important and why it was so important that we change this. And she did this thing with her hands and said, do you know what a keystone is? Some of you have heard this story. Do you know what a keystone is? And I said, well, it's Pennsylvania. I know what yes, I know what a keystone is. And she said, gerrymandering is the keystone of cronyism and control. And what I've realized, I understood a little bit of what she meant then, but as I've watched how our redistricting process played out this last time, and as I've tried to compare how this happens in Pennsylvania compared to other states, I've realized this is really about control. And this is really about those leaders saying, do it my way, or it's going to be really difficult for you. This mapping process that we have for our state House and Senate gives them far more control than is appropriate, and it has ripple effects throughout everything that happens in Pennsylvania. So this is a graphic that I created. Leaders draw districts, distorted districts protect incumbents, majority leaders control the rules, unfair procedural processes block reform. When I first saw that, I thought, That's problematic. I've had legislators say, "You have no clue. This goes way beyond that. It matters more than we realized." And gerrymandering puts power in the hands of party leaders, not voters, or the majority of legislators. So there are legislators who say, "Yeah, this is true, but it goes beyond, yes, they draw the lines, and yes, they control the rules." So the leaders also control the caucus budget, and that's unusual. There was a case a number of years ago where this kind of came out, and there were experts giving testimony that this is not the way it works. That each caucus has its budget, and that the leader controls the budget. But because the leaders control the budget, that means the leaders control caucus personnel. And I first thought it was the leaders control caucus personnel in Harrisburg, when there were legislators who wanted to meet with me not in their office because their staff would hear what we talked about. And I thought, well, that's odd. You're that staff's boss, right? And they're like, no, no, the staff answers to the caucus leader, because the caucus leader controls the budget, and then the caucus leader controls the personnel. But I met a legislator in his home office, and there was somebody in the outer office who he didn't want to hear. And I said, "But they're your staff, right?" And he goes, "They answer to the caucus leader." Even in their home offices, that can be the case. The leaders control the legislative agenda. And I've, had some conversations where the leaders say, "Oh no, the committee chairs decide what bills get heard." And the committee chairs say, "Well, they say that, but is that true?" Um, the leaders control the budget negotiations, and the leaders control the flow of major campaign donations. So this is all tied together. And what we find is the will of one leader or one major donor can outweigh the interests of all Pennsylvania and the voices of all other Pennsylvania legislators. Gerrymandering is the keystone that of cronyism and control, and of this whole web of control that I knew nothing about, and many folks who've done advocacy in Pennsylvania for years really didn't see how tightly this is all tied together. So we continue to do work on looking at the legislative process. We continue to see that Pennsylvania passes far fewer bills than most other states, even though we have a full-time legislature. Bills enacted in 2023, 2024, Pennsylvania compared to neighbor states. Some of them are, New York has a full-time legislature that gets paid more than ours, but Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia have very short sessions and yet pass more bills than Pennsylvania. And the number of bills shouldn't be, it's not that, oh, we want a lot of bills, but there are many, 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 many important bills, many important issues that never get addressed in Pennsylvania because the leaders don't want to address them. So when you see something that says Pennsylvania is the only state in the country that does not have a shale gas extraction fee, a shale gas extraction tax, there are bills to have a shale gas extraction tax introduced in every session. They never get a vote because the leaders take huge amounts of money from the shale gas industry. So any of these things you think, well, that's a kind of a no-brainer solution. Why wouldn't they give that a vote? There's a donor somewhere in the background saying, don't give that a vote, and it doesn't get a vote. We've actually discovered that sometimes things that have a lot of public support, one chamber will move it knowing the other chamber won't. And then the next session, the other chamber will move it knowing the other chamber. It's like, let's agree. This is never going to happen, but we can play a game with it, and it will never happen. So we have some reports. Is Gridlock Inevitable is the most recent. If you go to our Fix Harrisburg website, you can find these reports. And we've got an amazing team of folks who are digging into this, trying to understand how gerrymandering impacts our legislative process and how our legislative process is not aligned with the best interests of Pennsylvanians, and trying to understand what can we as citizens do about all of this. So we do have a page, the problem page. If you scroll down, you'll see our stories of dysfunction. And these are issues, and some of them you look and you think, lead for kids, like lead poisoning? Can't we solve that? Carbon monoxide detectors in childcare centers. Um, there's you look at some of these and you think skill games. Pennsylvania's one of the few states that doesn't regulate skill games and also doesn't tax skill games or have doesn't derive income from skill games because there are skill game donors who don't want that to happen. And will it ever happen? Maybe this session, maybe not. But it's important to understand why this matters. It's not just about maps. It's not just about who gets elected. It's the whole process of how our government works. So what we need, we have a bill, House Bill 31, Senate Bill 31, that was introduced last winter by Representative Steve Samuelson and Representative Mark Gillen, one a Democrat, one a Republican in the House. Senate Bill 131, introduced by Senator Tim Carney in the Senate. House Bill 31 has 59 co-sponsors. Senate Bill 131 has 20. And this bill would do basically one commission to draw congressional and state House and Senate districts, and three really important kind of legs to this process. One is the commission independence, that these are not people who have a partisan, they don't have a personal interest, they don't have a conflict of interest, and transparent public process. So people understand what's happening, people can give testimony, people can see the process play out, and then really clear prioritized mapping criteria. Those are the goals. We have a summary that explains this in more detail about how the commission independence would work, transparent public process, prioritized mapping standards. I'm not going to go into detail on the bill this evening, but you can, if you look at our Contact Your Legislator page, you'll find links to the summary document, to a comparison of the current process to current processes and what we're proposing. And there's also just a little bit about how these bills were drafted. We had a mapping criteria tested through a mapping contest. In other words, we looked at how maps were drawn for the 2021 mapping process. We looked at what the law currently says. We looked at how maps are being drawn, and we created a criteria that we thought would make it less possible to gerrymander the maps. And we had a mapping contest, talked with the mappers, and kind of fine-tuned that. And so the criteria was tested out in those maps. The bills incorporate provisions from bills across the last 30 years and responses, comments, ideas, thoughts, discussion from hundreds of legislative visits. When you do a legislative visit and you report back, that gets put into a document. We have a reservoir of comments from conversations with legislators, which is incredibly helpful because sometimes legislators say, this is what I've seen, these are the concerns I've had. So the bills were drafted to try to address the comments and suggestions. It also addresses prison gerrymandering, which has been a long-standing problem, which was partially addressed in the most recent mapping of the House and Senate, and would be addressed for all going forward. And then the bills were reviewed with improvements offered by multiple national experts, including staff from Common Cause, League of Women Voters, Latino Justice, the Prison Policy Initiative. And then the final draft we shared with the redistricting litigators at the Campaign Legal Center, folks who have seen litigation on redistricting in a number of different states, who have themselves created a document of best practices for independent redistricting commissions, and asked them to go through and see did this make sense? Were there things that we could improve? Was there language that wouldn't hold up in court? So the bills were given a lot of care. They were drafted with those three legislators that I discussed, with Cameron Allen, who was the policy staff director for Senator Carney, and then with Philip Hensley Robin, who is the executive director of Common Cause, and myself. We worked through that with input from all of these different entities before those bills were submitted. And to find a more detailed discussion with comments from all those folks, You can go look for a video called Introducing House Bill 31 and Senate Bill 131 on our Fair Districts PA YouTube channel. And so you can hear some of those people talk about specifics within those bills. Constitutional amendments in Pennsylvania take a long time. And so that's why we say these next six months are incredibly important. We're one of 24 states that doesn't allow a citizen initiative. We're one of 10 states that require constitutional amendments go through 2 consecutive legislative sessions before going on the ballot. And just 4 of those have 2-year legislative sessions. So we're one of 4 states that has a multi-year process. It was quite disheartening for me to watch Michigan when we were trying to get our bill passed back in 2018, to have them introduce a bill, citizen referendum, gather signatures, have it on the ballot, get it passed, and be done. And we were still slogging away trying to get the legislature to even give the bill a vote, knowing that it's a long process. And in both sessions, the constitutional amendment has to be passed at least 3 months before the next general election. So here's kind of a timeline. The bills were introduced last year. They would need to be passed in House and Senate, and we're saying they have to pass before Independence Day this year, because they'll be recessing for the summer, usually in July, and that's really the deadline. And then they would need to pass in the House and Senate again next session, and then go to referendum in the following in 2028 or 2029. So there could be the Independent Redistricting Commission formed as the census was going on in time for redistricting in 2031. I should mention this report answers a lot of questions for you. Why does PA need an independent redistricting commission? If you go to our Contact Your Legislator page on our website, you'll find links to the bills themselves, links to the bill summary that I just mentioned, links to the comparison document, and links to this 12-page report, which looks at some questions like why do we need to change the redistricting process? Why didn't the mapping done in 2021 solve everything? Why would this be an improvement? And what happened in other states? What would the process look like? Don't we already have good standards? People ask about competitive districts. There's a good section there explaining why competitive is not a good standard to put into law. And for Pennsylvania, I've looked at some districts that were drawn deliberately to be competitive. They would make your head spin, and you would not like them, because they kind of work as, almost like wheel spokes coming out of our urban areas out into our more rural areas to try to make those districts competitive. It's hard to do. There's a section about prison redistricting and why we need to do this now. One other piece in that report, which I think is incredibly helpful, is it looked at the gold standard criteria recommended by the Campaign Legal Center, and is that in the bills that we're proposing? And the answer is yes on all of them for our bills. I'm not showing you the whole grid, but if you take a look at that document, the appendix shows the different criteria suggested and how that, and does it play out in the bills we're proposing. I want to just quickly you might have this week, if you have a legislator, a representative who has not co-sponsored our bill, and we have your address in our system, our email system, you would have received on Monday or Tuesday an email asking you to contact your legislator to ask your representative, either by email or phone, or drop by their office if you'd like to do that, asking them to co-sponsor House Bill 31. And some of you have done that and reported back. If you haven't done it, please find that email and do that if your representative has not co-sponsored, because it's important that they hear from us. And we have legislators say, I never have heard from anybody on this except for you, to me. And I know for sure in many cases that's not accurate. It's important that they hear from you. And the more they hear from you, the more of you they hear from, the more likely it is that they'll actually consider this and take this question seriously. So we hear back from you, and sometimes from legislators themselves, objections. And I wanted to take just a couple minutes to suggest responses to some of those objections so that you're prepared when you talk to those legislators. So one is one objection is that the current process is accountable to voters and a commission would not be. And the reason they say it's accountable to voters and a commission would not be is because they are elected. I had one legislator say, we are the most accountable commission there is because we are elected. And what they forget is they're not the ones who do this. They are not the ones, they do not get to vote on the final House and Senate maps. And the commissioners don't have to tell why they drew the lines where they did. There's absolutely nothing about that process. And it puts the party leaders in more control than other states. And it's one of the least accountable processes in the country. So when a legislator says we are the most accountable and the commission would not be accountable, you might suggest that actually there's really nothing accountable about the current process for the Pennsylvania House and Senate. The congressional map is a little different because it does have to go through both chambers, be signed by the governor. So there is a little bit of accountability for it, but for the House and Senate, absolutely not. Quite a few legislators have said that House Bill 31 and Senate Bill 131 would require proportionality and that would be bad for Pennsylvania. Proportionality means, you need to have the exact same seats in proportion to the votes that are cast, which is difficult to do in some states. It's impossible to do because voters by party are spread very consistently throughout the state, or because the state only has one district. And so there are states that have one congressional district, but the state is actually a fairly purple state. So that might swing back and forth. One, for a period of time, it might be a Republican. For a period of time, it might be a Democrat. There's no way that can be proportional. In Pennsylvania, we have areas where the population is very, very heavily Democratic. Our more Republican areas tend to be not quite so heavily. So we have areas in Philadelphia that are, more than 90% Democratic, while there are lots of areas that are, 60 or 70% Republican. To make it strictly proportional is really not possible. And I would just say do a word search on the bill, which is very easy to do if they go onto our General Assembly website. There's no mention of proportionality in the bills, and we don't advocate for proportionality. Geographic distribution makes it impossible. Also, proportionality assumes a two-party system, and with now no accounting for third-party and independent voters. So how do you fit those folks into a proportional requirement? And there are much better metrics for measuring partisan fairness. The bill says a redistricting plan must not provide an advantage to any political party. An advantage to a political party shall be determined by using accepted measures of partisan fairness. Understanding that those measures are improving rapidly, so we didn't want to put a specific measure in there, but to say accepted measures of partisan fairness. And a redistricting plan may not be drawn favoring or disfavoring any incumbent. But if any legislator says to you, Fair Districts PA requires proportionality, say, no, it's not in the bill. It's not something we advocate for. We don't support it. We're not sure where that idea is coming from, but it's certainly not accurate. Responses to other objections. Fair Districts PA drew the PA House map. We've heard people say that, which I personally find a little amusing. We submitted House and Senate maps based on input from lots of folks and from mapping conversations, which I really enjoyed, looking at maps with people from around the state and talking about what would a good district for your community look like. But we have no evidence at all that those maps had any influence on the final maps. And it's really easy to just say, look at the maps. You can see the Fair Districts PA People's House map that we submitted. You can see the final PA House map. Just scan your eye along the top of the map, the top of the state, and you can see those districts are shaped very differently. And if you want to take time, once this is on YouTube, you can stop at that slide and take a closer look. And we'll also include I think we can include links to those maps so you can look at the maps more closely. But if any legislator says, well, Fair Districts PA drew the House map, so that's really not the case. And we have no evidence that the maps that we submitted, any piece, I have not found any district that showed up intact from our proposed map on the final House map. Another objection that we heard just recently is that an independent commission will result in worse gerrymandering, as it will be accountable to the moneyed interests to get commission members in place. I find that an interesting concern. Certainly, as the most populous swing state in the country, with few restrictions and safeguards for the influence of moneyed interests, we are a top target for outside spending and for attempts to influence gerrymandering. But the proposed bills, this proposed selection process and safeguards would make it much more difficult and less legal for moneyed interests to control the outcomes in selection or in the mapping process itself. And um, as I've said, there's a lot of influence of money right now in our political process. But an independent commission would lessen that, would make legislators less answerable to their leaders, and then therefore less answerable to the big donors who are trying to control the process. Right now, it allows money to flow through just a few people, and that money does flow through just a few people. Another one that has really been a challenge is that there are folks who in the past were strong supporters say, given what is happening nationally, this is not the time for an independent redistricting commission. You can't bring a knife fight to a gunfight. You have to fight fire with fire. I imagine some of you have heard that. I don't like the idea that our country is in a fight and that we are fighting fire with fire. I find that all really sad. My own thoughts are no one knows who will control the PA redistricting process in 2031. So why not put some safety in place for everybody so that we don't get sucked into this knife fight or this gunfight or whatever the fight is. And also, you can't save democracy by destroying democracy. So those are some thoughts I have, but I know for lots of folks that's not an adequate response. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about what's going on nationally, because I know for some of you that is of real interest, and I know for quite a few of our legislators, they do feel like there's an existential threat to our party, and we can't have an independent commission right now, and we need to be able to respond that we can and we should, and it would serve us best to do that. So just a little bit about what's going on nationally, and this is going to be a slide that's going to get messy. I was looking for a way to kind of visualize what's happening, and I came across this attempt to show the states that have been sucked into this redistricting war, as they're calling it. And certainly we know that Texas was the start of it, with our president telling the Texas legislature to find 5 more seats for Republicans. The idea that that would be said explicitly out loud is horrifying to me. The idea that legislators didn't simply say, that's wrong is horrifying to me, but that is the case, and the idea that the Supreme Court didn't say this is illegal and ridiculous is also horrifying. But that's where it started, and then we know that California with Governor Newsom said, "Oh yeah, you're going to do that. We're going to do that too," and then these other states have been pulled in. I just wanted to kind of map out the number of seats that were thought might be won in this ugly process, starting with the 5 in Texas, but then these other states jumping in. If you count the red states on here that could possibly be part of this, it gets up to 15. And then if you count the blue states, it gets up to 12, if my math is correct on that. But then what's happened with these? Well, first of all, Texas, they went ahead with it. There were Texas legislators who said, it's not a good idea. We're already kind of gerrymandered. If we gerrymander it worse, it might turn into a dummy mander. But they went ahead with that. So, and then the federal court said, you can't. And then the Supreme Court said, sure, go ahead. So those 5 seats maybe are in place for the GOP in Texas. California went ahead with their Proposition 50 to overturn the map drawn by an independent commission and put a explicitly gerrymandered map in place. And then these other states, some of these are questionable. They probably won't happen because of law or because the legislators just say this is a bad idea. So these are kind of questionable. It looks like they're not going to happen. Florida has some legal tangles, so that might not happen. Kansas just recently said, nope, we're not doing it. Imagine redrawing your whole state for 1 seat because It's a sad reality that's going on. I just want to say this whole thing really grieves me, the language surrounding it, the intent behind it, the way it's been handled. But there are some bright spots. And certainly Indiana has been one of those bright spots. I'm going to say a few more words about that. Indiana has been a bright spot. Missouri is set to go forward with this. And look at this, 300,000 signatures pulled together really quickly to repeal the referendum to put a new gerrymandered map in place. Imagine 300,000 citizens saying, we don't want this. And the legislature saying, oh, well, we're going to do it anyway, which is what's happening in Missouri. My question is, would you vote for a legislator who said we're going to go ahead with this when you've asked them not to? Are they dummymandering themselves, or are they setting themselves up in opposition to their voters? It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. And that question is there for Texas. For the first time ever, there are Texas Democrats now on every state and federal race on the 2026 ballot. That's never happened in Texas. But it's happening for either party to be on every single place available for state and federal seats on the ballot. Democrats have stepped up and said, we're going to push back hard. And there are folks looking at that saying this is going to be a really big dummymander, because they took their gerrymander, they spread it even further, they assumed people would vote the way they voted last time, and that's probably not going to happen. So how this plays out, hard to say. But in terms of the numbers, maybe the 5 from California for the Democrats, and maybe 6 for the Republicans, maybe 1, maybe 0. It's hard to say, but the millions and millions of dollars spent, the incredible amount of time spent, and there are legislators across the country saying there are important problems we should be solving, and instead we're drawing gerrymandered maps. It's an outcry, an outrage. In California, I just want to say, people say, well, the Californians voted for this, and it's important to know that the yes on Proposition 50 was framed completely throughout the whole time as we have to do this in response to what's happening elsewhere and to defend democracy. That was the referendum. And the yes side spent almost $97 million on this, compared to about $42 million on the no side. The amount of money spent on this is just staggering and rather tragic. The referendum title was authorizes temporary changes to congressional district maps in response to Texas partisan redistricting. In other words, it was framed as this is temporary and it's in response to Texas. And the pro statement affirmed California's commitment to independent, nonpartisan redistricting after the next census. In other words, this happens now, but they go back to an independent commission in the future. And even so, 92% of voters who responded in an exit poll said future districts should be drawn by an independent commission. People voted for it, but kind of held their nose and said, we don't like this. It shouldn't be this way. We believe in an independent commission. And here we are. The one bright spot for me has been Indiana in this. And in a sense, a bright spot, in a sense, a bad spot, sad spot. Indiana GOP Senator Senator Leising, came out very early against redistricting, and several other of her Republican colleagues just said, this is wrong. And she said, my constituents overwhelmingly oppose this, and because of that, I'm not going to do it. Her home was then targeted. And she said, well, even so, bomb threats, phone calls, swatting, whatever, we have to do what's right for our Indiana constituents. And there was a group of other senators who joined her, one in tears. One senator gave testimony in a hearing on the Senate floor, just in tears, saying, how has it come to this? How has it come to this? I'm here to represent my constituents. We need maps that allow us to represent our constituents, and yet we're being pressured to put together maps that would take away any representation for all of our constituents. And in the end, the Indiana Senate just said no. They said, we're not doing it. 21 Republicans broke with the pressure and said no. And so they overturned the redistricting bill 31-19. So to me, that's an encouragement that there are folks out there saying, we're here to represent voters. We're here to do the right thing. And we're not going to get involved in this kind of nonsense. And we would encourage our legislators to say the same, to say, let's put an independent commission in place. We don't have to get into a gunfight. We need to protect democracy. We need to protect representation, and we need to put a good independent commission in place. Governing had a really good op-ed about who are the losers in this, and it's the voters. When districts are contorted for political purposes, it makes it hard for constituents to know their representatives. It makes representative citizen interactions harder, and it lowers voter participation, and it diminishes faith into the democratic process. And this mid-decade redistricting, who is winning? Really nobody, but for sure, we know who's losing, and that's the people, and that's representative democracy, and that's trust in the way that system works. One thing I came across just recently, it came out in September, but I didn't see it until just recently. I want to call attention to this. If there's any lawyers here, please take this to your local bar and talk about it. The American Bar Association did a 2-year task force review of threats to American democracy, and their report is pretty sobering. They see significant threats to American democracy. They came out with this report in September, right in the middle of the kind of the escalation of this redistricting battle. And they said that redistricting should be taken out of the hands of legislators and committed to commissions composed of nonpartisan commissioners. And they said politicized redistricting is an important driving force in the crisis of democracy in the United States. It's at the core of political dysfunction and polarization today. And Americans are losing confidence that their elected representatives speak for them. Those representatives are less and less incentivized to govern effectively, thereby feeding the perception that democratic governance is ineffective. And the task force in 2008 came out with a recommendation for independent redistricting commissions. This task force reaffirmed that resolution, calling for all jurisdictions that are able to, at any level, to institute independent commissions. So this is in the middle of this escalating redistricting war. The American Bar Association said, this is really bad for democracy. This is really bad for the rule of law, and we stand against it, and we want to see independent redistricting commissions. So the next 6 months here in Pennsylvania will be critical. No one knows who will control the PA House or Senate. No one knows who will be in the governor's office, and no one knows who will hold the PA Supreme Court majority. We know that there was a lot of money spent on the judicial retention vote. And so right now it looks like there will be a Democratic majority in 2031, but we know that Justice Donahue will be retiring in 2 years, and things happen. People get sick, accidents, people retire. Who knows? The likelihood is that there'll be a Democratic majority, but it's not definite, and nobody knows who'll control the House or Senate or the governor's seat. So no one knows who will have the final say in determining Pennsylvania's districts unless it gets fixed. Then we will have an independent commission. And I will say, back in 2008, there was a good redistricting reform bill introduced by Representative Steve Samuelson, and the House was under the control of Democrats. And they thought they were going to have the upper hand when it came to 2011, and they blocked the bill. And then a lot had happened between 2008 and 2011, and they didn't have the upper hand. And then this could happen to either party. I would say for either party, don't you want to fix this before 2031 so the other party doesn't have the opportunity to gerrymander you into an irrelevant minority? What we do know is when one party uses redistricting to hold control, the partisan divide grows deeper and voters' distrust increases. So unless advocates are loud, this will never happen. That's what Senator Boscola said years ago. And our goal in the next 6 months is to be loud. And we've been loud before, but we need to be louder. We need to be more creative. We need to be more collaborative. And this is a really important year to call attention to this. It's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It'll be a big celebration year. And in this celebration, we want to say we need to celebrate the Pennsylvania Constitution as well. And the Pennsylvania Constitution promises us the right to reform and alter and reform our government. And it also promises us free and equal elections. And so we are having an event in Philly on January 17th. You are all invited, anybody who can get there. I know some of you, it's a pretty long drive, but we're going to have an event on the People's Plaza opposite Independence Hall from noon to 1 on January 17th, a rally to kind of look back at the Declaration of Independence, look back at the Pennsylvania Constitution, and to talk about what rights the Pennsylvania Constitution promise us and the work that we need to do to enjoy those rights. We will have a Ben Franklin reenactor. That will be fun. We have some really good musicians who will be joining us to sing. We will have a little bit of a Valley Forge winter vibe going, and we will have some leaders of organizations joining us. If you can be there, please join us. It'll be a beautiful spot right across from Independence Hall. We want to have a good crowd so that legislators in Philly see that we are serious and that we want this to get done. So if you can join us on January 17th, please do. And then we'll be in Harrisburg February 1st and 2nd. We'll have some workshops on Sunday afternoon, February 1st. February 2nd is Groundhog Day. And that seems a really appropriate day to be in Harrisburg to say, we've introduced bills again and again and again and again. And we'll be there with advocates from other organizations who have introduced bills again and again and again and again. So on that Sunday afternoon, we'll have some workshops on power mapping, kind of looking at the flow of money through our state legislature and how the power is consolidated. We'll be looking at our legislative dysfunction. We'll talk about redistricting. We'll have breakouts on these topics: money in politics, organizing and base building, and advocacy. And then on February 2nd, Groundhog Day, we will be in the Capitol building with display tables in the main rotunda. And we want to have a robust gathering in the rotunda on the steps. And then we are encouraging folks to visit their legislators, but also to stop by leaders' offices to say, we're here because we want these bills to get a vote. And from there, we want to be planning local and regional actions to say, give the bills a vote. So if you have leaders anywhere near you, and you all have leaders somewhere within a drive of you, we will be planning some actions to talk to the leaders or to be visible to the leaders, to be loud in saying, give these bills a vote. We have our website has the Take Action section. Please spend time there. There's a lot of information there. The Contact Your Legislator page has links to lots of information that could be really helpful to you. I just want to say, I know it's a kind of a challenging time, and I know with our Fair Districts team, some folks have said, will this happen? We've worked hard and nothing happened. What's different? I would say one thing that's different is it's a year where people are thinking about redistricting and gerrymandering. Many more people are thinking about this than were thinking about it in years past. So that's a big benefit. Another reason this is an important year is it's America 250, which gives us an opportunity to talk about constitutions, to talk about law, to talk about rights. But I also want to say this book, Hope in the Dark, Rebecca Solnit, who wrote it, says, she argues that the positive consequences of our acts are not always immediately seen, directly knowable, or even measurable, and that pessimism and despair rest on an unwarranted confidence about what's going to happen next. And I want to pause there because people say, well, this is going to happen. This isn't going to work. They're going to do this. They're going to block that. And kind of create a narrative of defeat. And when we create a narrative of defeat, it makes it really hard to be hopeful and to work towards the future that we want. And so I challenge you, I challenge myself. I wake up in the middle of the night and think, what in the world? What are we doing? What we're doing is we're asking our leaders to recognize the value embedded in our Constitution, embedded in our history, that the people have the right to alter and reform their government, and that the government is supposed to work for the people. and that our districts should reflect us, and that our legislators should listen to us. That's what we're asking for. Those are the values that we're working towards. And until we fix gerrymandering, until we have legislatures that actually answer to us and not to their leaders, that won't happen. So it's really important for us to say we might not see immediate success. This might some days feel really futile, but we don't want to assume that this isn't going to work, that it's not going to happen. We don't want to have an unwarranted confidence that yields pessimism and despair. We want to say, we can be heard, we can be loud, we can be creative, we can be persistent, and we can accomplish the change that we hope to see. One of our summer interns, we've had some wonderful summer interns, college students who worked with us through the summer, talking to people at fairs and festivals, gathering petition signatures. This one intern came back a second year, and when asked, "Why do you want to do this again?" he said, "The future of democracy runs through Pennsylvania." And I love that. I love that the future of democracy runs through Pennsylvania. And it's true that there are states around the country who don't have citizen initiative who watch us and say, can they get reform there? And there are states that were thrilled with the lawsuit that yielded a better map. And there are states that watch the fact that we have better maps now because we were so active in demanding them. And we want to say the future of democracy runs through Pennsylvania as it once did before. And that future is bright. And that future is positive and hopeful. And that future is a government that works for the people, that is of, by, and for the people. That's the future we want. That's the future we're working for. And so I thank you for being here. We really appreciate that you joined us tonight. Really appreciate that you're thinking about this, care about this. And please do take action. When you get those emails asking you to call or write your legislator, please do that. So thank you so much for being with us tonight.